In her book Hold Still, Sally Mann states, "Photography would seem to preserve our past and make it invulnerable to the distortions of repeated memorial superimpositions. But I think that is a fallacy. Photographs supplant and corrupt the past, all the while creating their own memories. As I held my childhood pictures in my hands, in the tenderness of my remembering, I also knew that with each photograph I was forgetting." The phrase "tenderness of my remembering" struck a chord. It had been 28 years since my brother passed away, and he had now been absent longer than he existed on this earth with me, yet his effect on my sense of self-identity was profound. The concept of remembrance and forgetting, and photography's role in aiding and abetting memory within this framework, became the intention of my photographic practice: to explore memory and its relationship to photography, and to begin to develop a visual language that examines how we use photographs to remember events in our past life. Or as Julia Hirsch says in her book, Family Photographs, Content, Meaning and Effect, family photographs themselves do not change, only the stories we tell about them. Part of the mourning process is the memorialisation of the subject, and the indexicality of the photographic image allows and encourages this process to take place. We see the absent before us vividly and can weave memory stories about them. The very clothes they wear, the objects that surround them, act as signifiers to past experience and events. As Hirsch goes on to say, when we know that a particular photograph is that of a family member, we can easily fit it into whatever fabric of family experience time has already woven. My work fell into two themes, memory and time, and I began to consider how I could illustrate and organise them in a photographic way. Location significant to the intention of the project was my starting point, and I wanted to use places that had an emotional connection to my brother. However, lockdown restrictions prevented this from happening, and so I had to create the same feeling in an alien landscape. Using photographs from our shared past, I had visited the different localities where I felt the punctum pierce me. Now, however, the connection was missing, so I began by splitting the concepts. I used the local landscape and began a series of abstract visualizations. I began to consider, how do we actually visualize a memory? I started to illustrate this using an image transfer technique, the result of which had not gone particularly well. The layered paper had not been able to be peeled away completely, and looking at it and the partial images that I'd registered on the page, I started to paint out areas, darkening some, lightening others to emphasise some of the details. This patchy, abstracted image was a good representation of how I considered I remembered an event, how I visualised this partial remembering of a moment in time. I began to consider, when looking at these images, and specifically the faded analogue images of my brother, where part of his face was faded and obscured. Was I really remembering the event? Was I remembering the photograph? Do photographs encourage us to remember events, people and places? Or, like Annette Coons considers, how we all remember different versions of events from our lives? Or do photographs act as gateways to memories? Research has led me to 4 photographers who all informed and helped me contextualise my work, and to some extent explored either mortality, memory and time within their own visual practice. Sally Mann, Don McCullin, Chris Marker, Todd Hido and aesthetically cinematographer Yaron Blaschke. Having listened to many interviews by Don McCullin and how he would often describe the process of creation of his landscapes, standing within a field and absorbing the landscape for days, and his thoughts on how you need to create a connection to the landscape around you, I considered the aesthetic of McCullin's images, the dark, almost overly processed prints that he created in his darkroom, his method of absorption into the landscape and developing his images for long hours, became for him a kind of mindful activity, a place to lose himself, a way of processing all the harrowing things he had seen and experienced. His work often seemed to be weeping. There was so much water within each of his images, which reflected back in the silvery surface of the photographic page. How could I try to create for the viewer an emotional connection with myself, so that they saw through my eyes? I began to use different types of lens to give me finer detail, and even a different kind of digital camera, again to record much higher detail. With this fine detail, it reminded me of a quote by Don McCullum, where he described the trees as like etchings, and it was this dark etched feeling which was the aesthetic I wanted to get into my images. I have only been shooting on prime lenses, and this was an attempt to reconnect me back into the landscape. I have to physically move myself within it, slowing down in my process, using a tripod and carefully constructing images to focus on specific areas within my editing. I would use dodge and burn techniques to reveal and hide certain parts of the image, and experimented with these, and I hoped to draw the viewer in, framing with a heavy vignette. Reading Perspectives on Place by Jesse Alexander had started to enrich my practice, to make the landscape work and to be able to create meaning, and to be less about aesthetic, composition and framing. The landscape was something to be meditated on and in, rather than viewed just framed from without. I needed to be right in the landscape, not viewing it as a stranger, even if the landscape I was recording was not my intended location. Edmund Burke wrote in his essay, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Sublime and the Beautiful, that to make anything very terrible, obscurity seems in general to be necessary. When we know the full extent of any danger, when we can accustom our eyes to it, a great deal of apprehension vanishes. Creating an emotional response in a viewer when they see the images, I began obscuring what they saw. I began to build a sense of tension. Peers had fed back to me on my work on how they felt unease when viewing my work. They wanted to look into the image but felt apprehension. Director of photography Yaron Blachesky's The Lighthouse offered further aesthetic ideas. The use of film to add texture, camera angles, could create odd psychological feelings. However, he made me consider most my frame shape. In The Lighthouse, he had used a 1:2 aspect ratio to create a sense of claustrophobia and confinement, and applying this to my memory visualizations and landscapes helped me to create a feeling of confinement, and being unable to see the image clearly added to this. Obscuring parts of the images or creating images that were sterile, devoid of life, and used strongly contrasting black and white manifested a mood of uncertainty, melancholy and the uncanny, and my portfolio review made me question this further and the editing techniques I was using, so I began to experiment with plastic lenses on my digital camera. I've pushed back the use of film into the next module, when I'll have the time to work at the pace it requires and can process it on the shore.